Welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast, Coffee Break Sessions, presented by Strategic Treasurer. The show where we cover foundational topics and core Treasury issues in about the same amount of time it takes you to drink your cup of coffee. I'll be your host, Jonathan, Media Production Specialist here at Strategic Treasurer, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. We are back for another episode of the Coffee Break Session. Today, I have with me again, Craig Jeffery. Craig, welcome back to the show.
Hello, John.
So today we're going to go a little more into the economic side with what is fiscal stimulus. Craig, what is fiscal stimulus?
It's a topic of today's coffee break session. It's really government policies and spending that's ostensibly meant to change economic conditions for the better, to help things out. So fiscal as opposed to monetary.
Okay. And its main purpose?
Well, it's meant to kickstart or stimulate a sluggish economy. Sometimes it's meant to increase employment. And oftentimes it's used during periods of either stagflation or recessions. And it's, the government's pumping money into the economy for more spending and or investment. So it's meant to, create a little bit of a flash fire to move things along.
And how does fiscal stimulus affect the economy?
I don't want to say this too dramatically, but they flood the economy with money. They push money out. Let's say they'll send checks or payments directly to citizens, or they might lower tax rates or lower withholding rates. And so since there's more money in the economy, people spend it, or they might invest it or save it, but typically they're spending it. And this means when they do that, that stimulates the economy.
Yeah, this has been trending recently with some stuff in the news.
Yeah, certainly this idea of we put money in the economy, it sparks some things. If that worked perfectly 100%, the government could just keep pumping money out to people and they would spend it. Of course, that doesn't necessarily by itself increase activity, but it's meant to be like priming the pump. If you've ever used a pump, you have to put a little bit of water in there to create the draw and the suction to pull water out of the well, to pull liquidity out of the well to get things going. And so that's the same type of concept.
Yeah. And to pull this in for our main core audience, how does this impact finance and treasury?
It can impact it a couple different ways. I think first, how should Treasury look at it? Treasury should look at the various potential situations that are occurring, what's proposed, generally just know what's being proposed. But the impact could be on the cost of borrowing, could impact interest rates, increasing them or possibly decreasing them. Will this spur economic growth or decline? And if it's certain items, certain funds sent to individual citizens, if you're in the retail industry or restaurant business, maybe that will result in very quick increases. They start going out to dinner more, for example. So what's the overall economic situation? How will that change? Will the cost of borrowing shift? Will interest rates move up or down based on this? And how will this impact the ability of the company's customers to buy and or to pay? So those are the impact on Treasury, just being aware of the broader economics impacts Treasury.
Does it always react the same? Like they pumped out a bunch of stimulus back in 2020 with COVID. The markets and the interest rates and everything reacted to that in a certain way. If they decided to do that again, let's say next year or in 10 years, are we going to see similar reactions, or do people say that there's a lot of variance in how things can react?
There's a lot of variable views on how is this impactful at all, if it's impactful at what levels. And there's other factors that go into this. What's the overall debt? If you're reducing tax rates, that's putting more cash into people's hands. Is that reducing the amount that the government takes in? Or is it at a point where the reduction in the rate ultimately results in a higher tax yield? So there's a number of things that can roll into the calculus here. And people have different views, right? If you go from 30% tax rate down to 2%, your tax yield is going to be lower. And so there's some feedback loop. But we've seen sometimes where very high tax rates are lowered, there might be less deductions, but it oftentimes creates more tax receipts. And that can either be for a short period of time or a long period of time. And it's fun to hear the economists argue. It's less fun to hear the politicians argue, but
Okay, so you mentioned tax cuts. Do you want to go into the common tools used in fiscal stimulus?
Yeah, so government for spending, the government may spend directly on what they would call, in the U.S., they often term them shovel-ready projects. So those are infrastructure projects, putting in bridges, roads. Maybe everything's approved, ready to go. They just needed funding. Maybe states need funding. And so the states may put their budget in or apply for these funds. And so immediately, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars gets put into these large projects. And then all these people are hired onto these projects. So government spending is one way. Tax cuts are another. This could be corporate, personal income tax that create that demand. Could be direct payments. States do this as well. Energy prices are high. The state may have had a significant yield on tax paid at the pump. And so they send $500 to taxpayers, in a particular state. There's also subsidies. So direct spending, lower tax rates. Sometimes they also will reduce the tax withholding. And so it doesn't change the actual tax rate, but people get more money in their take-home pay. And a huge portion of those people will spend it. So those are a couple of the different tools that are used.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And on the funding side, how is all this funded? That's the question everyone wants to know.
That's the question everybody has. What they want to know is how do they do that? Well, it's usually borrowing, right? Government's issuing some type of debt, or if they had a surplus. In the case of sending basically a rebate, let's say a state collected more money than they spent, they can either increase their spending or they send it back. And some of them have done that, which I find quite surprising and quite helpful, that people are getting money back. They may have spent it on taxes for gas, and now it's come back to them. So usually it's borrowing. Sometimes it's from excess, but almost always from borrowing.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing all this info to our listeners. Remember to tune back every first and third Thursday of the month for another episode of the Coffee Break Sessions. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, John.
This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.